Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this screening of Lingua Franca, directed by acclaimed filmmaker Isabel Sandoval. Lingua Franca premiered at the 2019 edition of the Venice Film Festival, but has yet to have a UK release. So we're so pleased and honored to be able to reintroduce this magnificent film to audiences through tapes found in translation season. My name is Xuanlin Tham, and I'm a Singaporean film critic and programmer based in Edinburgh, the UK. Today, I'm so excited and grateful to be joined by the queen of sensual cinema herself, writer, director, editor, and all-around cinematic powerhouse, Isabel Sandoval, to talk about Lingua Franca. So hello, Isabel, how are you doing?
Hi, Xuanlin. Thank you so much. I'm so excited and thrilled to be here. And thank you all for watching Lingua Franca.
You look radiant, by the way, so thank you so much. I think maybe a good place to start is to ask where the seeds of inspiration for Lingua Franca came from. How did this story about an undocumented trans Filipina care worker in Brooklyn take shape? And this is not an autobiographical film, as you've said, but did the personal and the fictional find some kind of interplay for you in writing it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Lingua Franca is my third feature film, but it is my first after my transition. And my first two features, were really the opposite of autobiographical. Although Senorita, my very first film, which I wrote, directed, and I also starred and I played a trans woman even before I knew for sure that I was transgender. And my second film apparition was about cloistered nuns during the 70s in the Philippines. And I think, when I was transitioning, that was when I started working on the ideas that would become Lingua Franca. And I think I also just became more open and embracing of sexuality and desire. I grew up Roman Catholic in the Philippines, which is a very neurotically Catholic country. And so growing up, there was a lot of feelings of shame or guilt around, sex. And also when I started realizing that I was queer, at a young age, while I was attending an all-boys Catholic school, we realized I was gay. And then it was not until I moved to America that I realized that I was trans. And I think that burgeoning sense of comfort and acceptance of who I am kind of really fueled the idea for Lingua Franca. And also the themes that I typically am drawn to in my work, my protagonists tend to be women who are disempowered or disadvantaged in some way, and they are forced to confront very personal dilemmas and make very personal choices in a milieu or setting that is fraught, socially, politically, economically. And so that's how the premise for Lingua Franca of this undocumented Filipino trans woman in New York who must, find a way to have legal status in the US as she's becoming romantically involved with a man who might not necessarily be aware that she's trans came together. But when I first started making it, that legal status dilemma was not in play yet, but halfway through writing Lingua Franca was when Trump got elected. And just like a lot of immigrants and minorities in the US at that time, especially in the first few months after he, won the election, just that feeling of uncertainty, that paranoia, and just that anxiety about what's going to happen to us. And so I essentially distilled that feeling and that headspace into what would become the prevailing mood and atmosphere of Lingua Franca.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's something that you get so like resonant from the film. And I know you've said before, Lingua Franca kind of diverges from a social realism, even though you read the premise and that seems like that's the kind of film it will be. Like, it's an undeniably political film, but still it's kind of, like you said, it filters through as a more kind of emotional and psychological violence, and that creates the atmosphere in the film. And I think something that stands out to me so much is that actually this is a battle of intimacies almost. Like, you have the backdrop to Olivia's desires is another kind of unwanted intimacy, which is the intimacy of the state with her body and the way that it tries to police her body as an immigrant, but also as a trans woman. So the way that that bleeds into both the personal and the political, I think, is so masterfully achieved. And in that way, I think her reclamation of her desires, or her ability to state her desires and act on them so boldly, is that reclamation of agency as well on that level.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, for me, I feel like a lot of American films that feature the lives and experiences of minority characters are almost kind of from, from a seemingly omniscient, objective, and distant perspective, and that they're essentially, we're specimens in a petri dish. And also there's kind of a didacticism and preachiness that informs these films. And for me, I think my biggest eureka moment about how to approach this kind of story was to have it be about Olivia's subjectivity, and to really put the audience kind of in her emotional and psychological space as she's going through, her day-to-day life, the mundane rituals, and of course the bigger predicament that she's in terms of her legal status. And key to kind of unlocking that subjectivity is to really feel and experience her desire and to visualize that on screen. As you mentioned, like desire, for me, I mean, just the ability to express desire, to want, something or somebody as an expression, is a very concrete expression of agency, and I think selfhood. And so I think just by that seemingly, I guess, subtle gesture, I feel that it's quite subversive and revolutionary in that sense, in that we don't often get inside the minds and kind of the spirit of these characters. And I wanted to attempt that, Lingua Franca, having grown up in the Philippines, art house Philippine cinema, especially in the last 50 years. In the 70s, it was Lino Broca. Our Filipino cinema is known for its social realist orientation. And so that was kind of where I was coming from initially. And then I think organically, as I was making more films, my own voice and sensibility as a filmmaker really emerged. And that's when I think the delicacy and then the sensuality and the poetry emerged. And now I feel like my aesthetic and my sensibility as a filmmaker is that my films have strong political underpinnings. Their treatises are explorations of power that is married with a style that is sensuous and lyrical and poetic.
Absolutely. And there's kind of two questions there I think I have kind of off the back of that. And the first one was about that aesthetic sensibility that you talk about that is so strong with your films, Lingua Franca, and also your recent short film Shangri-La as well. It has such a strong poetic lyrical, kind of heightened aesthetic sensibility. And you've spoken before about how your work has kind of converged with Wong Kar-wai's kind of heightened romanticism in that way. But I actually find there's so much range even in Lingua Franca from that, but also to kind of the stark materiality of, for example, like Alex's slaughterhouse, and then the whole almost kind of psychological thriller-esque surveillance kind of zooming scenes that we see following Olivia around the city. I just wanted to ask how you kind of you slide so seamlessly in between these different types of gazes, and I wanted to ask what drove your vision behind that evolving style.
I think what I was really after, experientially in making lingua franca, is to make it feel immersive and visceral in that way, and that you really have a concrete sense, an immersive sense of the setting and the milieu that these characters live in. The opening closing montages, those like static portraits and snapshots of landscapes that are typically and quintessentially American. I actually shot those after a few months after principal photography, in that, I was also very much influenced by Chantal Ackerman, News from Home, and especially in just the chronicling of the everyday rituals of these women characters. Jean Delman as well was a major influence for me. And yeah, the way I shot the sex scene, I also wanted it not to be just about the sex, but to be a genuine character moment for Olivia, and that we are expecting to see. Just, I think typically the sex scenes are comprised of shots of body parts and naked bodies gyrating against each other, but I wanted to be an opportunity to actually be about an expression of her agency and her complexity by showing kind of the whole gamut of thoughts and emotions that she's feeling in that moment. Like, you see her kind of experiencing that pleasure, but also grappling with the realization that she might be putting herself in physical danger by being intimate with a man who's not aware that she's trans. And so, yeah, I think for me, kind of going through this, that the range of styles that I did lingua franca was in the service of making it feel as immersive and real as I can make it, but also in a way emotive. And I also, one of the things that I really enjoyed doing here is the juxtaposition of very intimate shots, like the personal, and cutting from, let's say, the tight shot of her face as she's in pleasure, and cutting from that to this extreme wide shot of Olivia standing on the subway platform as the camera slowly zooms in, and inducing that feeling of claustrophobia and that paranoia as well. And that, yeah, I mean, I try to never forget that these personal lives are very much influenced, and anchored by the bigger sociopolitical forces that that affect these characters given their settings.
And I think, that's so, it really comes through. It's like the way that you've kind of molded style perfectly to embed us deeper and deeper into her psyche and to the changing contours of her psyche. And that translates in parallel to, I think, the way you've charted the erotic energy from, I think, the 3 sex scenes. Because to me, I think lingua franca has 3 sex scenes. The first one is that quite restrained masturbation scene where she kind of puts the earphones in, but then we cut away. And then the second scene is like the heightened fantasy scene where it kind of cuts from Alex reading the letter to her fantasizing, and that's extremely kind of formally perfectionist fantasy scene of the hands like caressing her body. But then that's in great contrast to the actual consummation of the sex itself, right? Where it's a lot more like raw and visceral and animalistic. And
Yeah.
I think that the contrast, the charts between those three is really such a realistic, maybe, depiction of the different manifestations of desire. And I wanted to ask how you managed to, or like what you did to explore that gap, or the kind of distance between fantasy and reality with sex and sensuality.
Yeah, for me, that kind of fantasy slash dream sequence, I I think it, what appeals to me the most about it is just the aesthetics of getting very close to an intimate, visually with the bodies and hands. And I think it's also just me personally as both a filmmaker and as a person becoming comfortable in my own skin, and that I've finally started to love and just revel in who I am physically as a person. And with the assistance of, this dream, this phantom man and that fantasy and the physical, like the real sex scene, I also, wanted to subvert it in that it's, not a leery type of sex scene that we're just kind of fixating on or obsessing, bodies. And especially, I feel like there is a particular fixation on the bodies of trans individuals, trans women, for instance, and instead of having be about just the bodies, to really have it be mostly on her face and essentially read the feelings and the thoughts that she's experiencing and going through in that moment, and transform it from the sex scene that that we've come to expect in most films into kind of a window, and a window into her more innermost subjectivity. I think that in contemporary cinema, the one terra incognita that hasn't been explored yet is really the subjectivity of minorities, women, and queer people, and that's what I want to explore more in my own work in the future.
And you are doing that in such amazing ways, so which is why it's so exciting to watch you. And I think your perspective on this is just, you've illustrated it with such kind of truthfulness and ownership over your material. And that's what I wanted to ask you about, is that you've spoken before about the title of auteur and what that means to you as like a political manifesto, almost as like of ownership and a refusal to kind of to become acceptable to the current status quo of film exhibition and film production. And could you tell us a little bit more about what it means to have such a degree of like ownership over your film, especially something like Lingua Franca, where you've written, directed, edited it, and acted in it as well?
Yeah, I think especially in the making of Lingua Franca, I really take pride in claiming that title of auteur, because one, essentially I was the architect of the vision behind the film, and I think it also embodies and showcases a distinct and singular aesthetic sensibility that I think has come to emerge in my work 3 features in. And also politically, having made that kind of film in the US, and in that system, of course, it's independent and it's made outside of the Hollywood studio system. But nominally, when we think of auteurs, the idea of auteur is almost always attached to a cisgender white male. And that's what I feel is most transgressive about me kind of claiming that I'm the auteur. It's because, I want other artists, especially emerging and aspiring, artists and filmmakers, to know that it's not just cisgender white men that can make art and can really stake a claim in the cinematic landscape. And yeah, I think both aesthetically and politically, I take pride in the title, and I want to continue making work that is bold and ambitious, and it takes a lot of risks. I feel like I'm in a interesting point in my career now that Lingua Franca has somewhat been embraced by the establishment that's opened up opportunities for me. And I'm very grateful to the likes of Ava DuVernay herself, a wonderful color filmmaker and auteur who's kicked the doors open for minority filmmakers like myself to, even though I might be taking on studio projects, I want to also not lose sight of my own passion projects and films that I feel truly express my my political and artistic sensibilities.
And that's such a good kind of segue, I think, to ask about your next film, Tropical Gothic, which me and I think so many people are so excited to hear about this. It's you're returning to shoot a film in the Philippines, a set in the 16th century, the colonial Philippines. And it's about a woman who pretends to be possessed by, is it the dead wife of a colonial master? It sounds so incredible. And I was wondering if you could tell us if there are any kind of similarities maybe to your film Apparition, and maybe also drawing from some of that psychological thriller aspects of Lingua Franca as well.
Yeah, I think, what's interesting is that I feel like besides the recurrent theme or motif of women who are forced to make these personal choices in a fraud environment, I am also drawn to women with secrets in a way. And yeah, what's interesting is that I came up with the idea for Tropical Gothic after my very first time watching at an artist residency, Vertigo, Hitchcock's Vertigo, and how that's, I feel like the quintessential male gazy film, and it's also the most quintessential Hitchcock film in that it's about his, obsession to the point of just this desire to smother blondes. And I wanted to subvert that, male gaze and have it about this disempowered woman who is the one who's has an eye on and manipulating the male character. And it's interesting because I've lived in the US for over 15 years, but for this story, I'm drawn back, pulled back to my roots, as a Filipino-born person. And as they say, like, you can take the person out of the Philippines, but you can't take the Philippines out of the person. But I wanted to make this in the American, studio system in Hollywood, precisely because the Philippines has a history of not only being colonized by Spain for over 300 years, but it was actually the US that took over for 50 years after that. And so I wanted to finance this subversive film that explores and critiques imperialism and colonialism using Hollywood money. And, telling it from the perspective not of the colonizer, but of the colonial subject, who is the main subjectivity and the principal subjectivity, and the emotional center of the film as well.
it seems just like you're building such a rich world of mythology with all of your films, and it's incredible to see. And I think kind of to link back to Lingua Franca, I mean, I was always so caught by the title of the film, you know, Lingua Franca to as a bridging language, and the film centers obviously on immigrants, and especially I think one relationship that's so touching in the story is between Olga and Olivia, and about the language they've created, you know, between the phone calls and the pretending that Janusz is still alive sometimes, you know, about the languages that we craft in order to make community when we're kind of lost and abridged and at sea. And I just think that this theme of translation is not just about making things equal, it's about creating something new. And I think that that speaks to me so much about your work. I think your work is that kind of translation where, you know, it's world building translation, not just world translating. I think that might be all that we have time for. It's been such an honor to talk to you, Isabel. Thank you so much.
Pleasure as well, Xuanlin. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much, and we're so grateful to be able to be bringing Lingua Franca to cinemas in the UK through the Found in Translation season by Tape, which is a season of special screenings and events celebrating the incredible work of Isabel Sandoval, a US-based Filipina filmmaker and actress, and as well Leila Bouzid, Tunisian screenwriter and director. So we'll be screening Lingua Franca and Leila's A Tale of Love and Desire as part of 12 special events that will be presented in partnership with writers and poetry collectives in 6 venues across the UK. And these films will be made available, super excitingly, to all UK cinemas for one-off screenings. And in line with our previous work, these films obviously explore culture clashes, language barriers, and our attitudes towards immigration. They're all fantastic and definitely need so much more UK love. And we're so glad to be bringing them to cinemas. And we're so honored again to be able to be part of bringing this experience to you all, and also to have Isabel with us today. So thank you so much for sharing your beautiful words with us. It's been an honor. Thank you.
And thank you to Tape and Ezra for programming Lingua Franca, and I hope you all also support and watch A Tale of Love and Desire.